So thanks for coming on.
Thank you for having me. It's a pleasure to be here.
Okay, unfinished history. What's unfinished about the history of the Holocaust?
Okay, it's a good question. I mean unfinished in two senses, really. Firstly, I think that all history, in a sense, is unfinished. There's a kind of paradox that the subjects that are most important to us, for whatever reason, are those that generate the most scholarly literature and popular literature. In other words, even though we know a lot about a topic, we want to know more and more about it, and we want to keep reinterpreting it. So I believe that all history, in a sense, is contemporary history. That's to say, we always rewrite the past on the basis of our present situation. The things that are going on in the present, in a way, shape the questions that we ask of the past. And so that's true when we think of the history of the Holocaust, even over the last 20 years. The questions that show up, what counts as a source, what kinds of topics we're interested in, these things are always changing in the light of the wider culture. Historians are also people who live in a broader society, and so the things that are going on politically, culturally, and so on are, of course, shaping the things that we're interested in. So in that sense, history is always unfinished. But with respect to the Holocaust, I mean it in a second sense, which is that the Holocaust didn't end in 1945. It did in an obvious sense, but of course, for the survivors and their descendants, it didn't. The after effects are still felt. And as a huge literature on what we might now call, I suppose, aftermath studies of the Holocaust, from the DP camps to debates about Zionism, the founding of Israel, Holocaust trials, Holocaust film, debates about restitution, all of these things, the books like you've written on Holocaust denial, show that the Holocaust remains an extremely important part of our culture. And in that sense, it's also unfinished. Like the history of the last 80 years since the Holocaust is also part of the history of the Holocaust.
Yeah, let's talk about that for a second, the kind of historiography of the Holocaust, but even more broadly, anything that happened in the past. So, of course, you're right. We reinterpret things based on current cultural interests and so on. But there really is a past. I mean, certain things happened, and presumably we can know more or less what really happened, regardless of the bias or the worldview of the historian. Mm-hmm. I guess maybe that applies to more, specific facts, like how many people were killed at Auschwitz. Well, presumably we can get pretty close to a number within an error bar of, 1% or something like that, if we have enough sources. I guess what you're talking about is maybe in the broader context, of why it happened, what led to it, what were the intellectual roots of Nazism and its blood and soil philosophy, and what kind of racism was it. Maybe that is what you're talking about more.
Exactly. I'm talking about interpretation. I think that if you read a historian's text, any one particular statement can be empirically proven or not on the basis of sources. Bearing in mind, of course, that a historian has to approach sources critically and subject them to source criticism, because the fact that a source exists doesn't mean that what the source says or looks like is actually what happened. We know that Goebbels' diaries say a lot of things, but they don't necessarily reflect what was actually happening. But you're right, we can empirically confirm individual statements that historians make in their texts. But in a sense, that's boring. It's like saying, an architect should ensure that the house he designs should stand up. I mean, okay, sure, but the design of the house can be infinitely varied, and the same is true of a historian's text. That what's interesting in history writing, and particularly in a subject where the literature is so large, as with the Holocaust, is the existence of debate, exactly as you say, about why a particular thing happened, how it happened, and so on. Those are the debates that keep the scholarship alive and that filter through or reflect popular culture and its representations of the Holocaust.
Yeah, maybe an example of this would be the intentionalist versus functionalist debate in Holocaust scholarship. Maybe that's not around anymore, but was in the 90s when I was reading all this stuff. That is to say, to what extent did Hitler intend to exterminate European Jewry from the very beginning, like 1920s? Or did it develop slowly over the decades, and it was a function of the war and how the war was developing and unfolding over time, and it's a very contingent event? I don't know. How do you think about that particular
I
debate.
mean, that debate doesn't exist in the same way as it did in the 90s, but it does still exist. The terminology is slightly different, but I think the basic debate itself is still there. And I think many of my colleagues still teach my students about it because it's a fundamental way of shaping the interpretive framework for thinking about the way in which the Holocaust unfolded. I think for the most part now, there are no, maybe with a very few exceptions, there are no historians who are hardline intentionalists who believe that from 1920 and the first Nazi party program that Hitler and the Nazis intended to kill the Jews of Europe. Then, just as there are, I think, no hardline functionalists who say it was all total accident. The Nazis fell into this project without really thinking about it and not knowing what they were doing. I think that this book has been characterized by some reviewers as intentionalist in the sense you just described. And I think that's correct because I place a lot of emphasis on ideology. But what I show is that the way in which the Holocaust unfolded in different places and at different times was shaped by what we would 20 or 30 years ago have called a functionalist approach, which is to say it was shaped by military circumstances, which population groups the Nazis could put their hands on at any given moment in time, what their allies were doing, what the Allied powers were preventing them from doing, all of these different factors, the infighting between different groups within the Nazi party and the civil service and the Wehrmacht and other institutions, all of this shapes the way in which the Holocaust unfolded. But I think without a basic understanding of Nazi ideology, you can't explain why it was the Jews that were targeted in the first place. And so then you do have to go back to the Nazi party program, to Mein Kampf, to the writings of the early Nazis, and those who inspired them, Dietrich Eckart and Darré and people like that, in order to show why and how the Nazis were obsessed with the Jews. It's not the same thing as saying that the Nazis intended to kill them, but they understood the world through this kind of apocalyptic lens of world history being the struggle between good and evil, that's to say Aryan and non-Aryan, that's to say German and Jew.
Yeah, I've read a lot on Holocaust studies, and I'm still amazed how much I learned from your book. It's like, how did I not know that? It's like there's just so much to know. You even said no one person can know the whole Holocaust literature, right? So, I mean, on this particular question, like Nazi ideology, I love the way you phrased that. It's like, it sounds oxymoronic to ask for the intellectual origins or predecessors of the Nazi idea. It just seems kind of too crude to have an intellectual origins. But of course, all ideologies it comes from somewhere. So how far back do you go? Like in the 19th century, eugenics and race science and social Darwinism and that sort of thing? Or even further?
I think all of those things are part of the mix. If you read Mein Kampf, which I don't recommend, but if you do, then you see that, I mean, it's mind-numbingly dull, right? Yeah, it's terrible. You want to scratch your eyes out by the end of it. But Hitler borrows, I mean, he's not an original thinker. He doesn't really understand Darwin. He certainly doesn't really understand Nietzsche. It's a pick and mix grab bag of stuff that he's found in his reading, sewn together with this pompous grandiloquence and this assuredness that he's on the right path. And he brings all these things together. But what's interesting and what I think marks out Nazism from other varieties of fascism, or let's say from eugenics or anti-feminism or race thinking, any of the things that feed into Nazi ideology, is the virulence with which the mix is put together. So all of these things that characterize late 19th, early 20th century, what should we call it, anti-liberal rejectionism, anti-Enlightenment rejectionism, these things come together in a violent mix in Mein Kampf and in the Nazi ideology more general. And it's that violence and that apocalypticism that I think really marks out the Nazi ideology. Thinking about it as an intellectual project, one of the thinkers who I cite, a man called Aurel Kolnai, wrote a book in 1938 called The War Against the West, which he wrote in English, having never set foot in an English-speaking country, sitting in a Nazi cafe in Vienna. And he writes in his letters how he took great pleasure in writing this analysis of Nazism while surrounded by all these Nazis. In 1938, it's a 600 or so page analysis of the writings of Nazi philosophers, and it's still one of the finest studies of those writers, precisely because he takes them seriously. Obviously, he doesn't like what they say, but he says, we can't really get to grips with Nazism unless we engage seriously with its thought. And his colleague, Eric Fergelin, referred to Nazi ideology as a system of scientific superstition, which is a quotation I use in the book. And I think that little summary is brilliant. Really, this combination of very up-to-date thinking, but based on a kind of unprovable mysticism, is a fantastic way of understanding Nazi ideology.
Yeah, I like how you wrote this here. Nazism was the most extreme manifestation of sentiments that were quite common and for which Hitler acted as a kind of rainmaker or shaman. Oh, you're quoting Stone there. Yeah. The defeat of his regime has left us with a dark energy, a deep psychology of fascist fascination and genocidal fantasy that people turn into instinctively in moments of crisis. Oh, there you're kind of bringing it up to current events. Anyway, it's kind of a mystical conspiracy theory. Yeah, and again, blood and soil. Yeah, it's sort of anti-Enlightenment, romanticism, something like that.
That's crucial. But on the other hand, it also buys into, well, let's put it this way. Nazism is itself a symptom of modernity. It's an ideology that's only thinkable in modernity because it's a rejection of certain characteristics of modernity. But it also is an alternative form of modernity. Ernst Bloch, the what should we call him, the kind of renegade Marxist thinker, talked about Nazi ideology as being asynchronous. He also took the Nazis seriously as thinkers, unlike most Marxist thinkers, and he said it might seem asynchronous, out of time, this obsession with the Teutons and the Norns and all this medieval nonsense, these mythologies of the Norns in the forest and such. But he says the people who believe in it, they're not simply dupes of a few capitalist bosses who are trying to lead the masses away from recognizing their true interests. They're people who genuinely believe in this stuff. At the same time, they also want their people's radio, their people's car, their fridges, their autobahns, and all of the facets of modernity. I just read an excellent book by John Guza, emeritus professor at the American University in Paris, who has written this book on Nazi technocracy. And he writes about Richard Feder and Fritz Todt and Albert Speer as the leaders of the Nazi technology movement, and shows how they're, to varying degrees, totally bought into the Nazi ideology of blood and soil and so on, but nevertheless were 20th century engineers who knew how to build bridges and roads and saw those things as part of the project to create the racial society that would be the bright future for the German people.
Yeah, that's right. Eisenhower kind of orchestrated the building of the interstate system inspired by the Autobahn. It was a very effective way of moving a lot of people very quickly.
Yeah, but the New Deal came without the medieval guff. I mean,
yeah, right. So maybe the implementation of genocide is technocratic or scientific, although, as you point out, at least half the people killed were not killed in gas chambers, much more crudely. But the ideology behind it, why would somebody want to orchestrate a technological genocide? That's not science or a science based. That's more, I don't know, romantic ideology or blood and soil. It's a mystical, sort of anti-scientific.
Agreed. I mean, the whole of Nazism rests on this mystical premise, which is that the Jews, or better put, the Jew, the international Jew, is somehow behind this political conspiracy theory. So communism is driven by the Jews, capitalism is driven by the Jews. Everything bad that happens in world history is as a result of the machinations of the Jews. And I don't think, a la Goldhagen, let's say, that the majority of German people or Europeans more broadly at this time believe this. What matters is that the leading Nazis who direct what becomes the Holocaust believe it, and they really do believe it. And one of the things that's extraordinary, I mean, you've already referred to the mountainous scholarship on the Holocaust, but what's amazing is that in the 12 years that the Nazi regime existed, it produced a body of literature that is so vast that we're still discovering it in terms of, well, irrespective of what you look at, whether it's the way, mathematics textbooks at schools, or race theory in the narrow sense, or engineering journals. All of these things are absolutely crammed full with mystical race theory. And that's extraordinary. And I give one example in the book of the control of typhus in the Łódź ghetto. When there's an outbreak of typhus, which of course happens if you cram a huge number of people into a tiny space and don't provide them with food and clean water and so on, the Nazis take what are then the medically correct methods for dealing with the outbreak, but they start from an assumption which says that Jews are carriers of typhus. And so there's this mystical basis on which the whole thing rests, and yet they're also the science to deal with it. So they kind of create the situation that's a self-fulfilling prophecy, that the Jews become embodiments of typhus, but then what they do is what any state or local council would do in the face of a typhus outbreak.
Right. You cram them into these ghettos, and then you say, look how these Jews live.
Mm-hmm, exactly.
Yeah, as if it's their fault they're in the ghetto.
Right. Exactly so.
Yeah. Yeah. You mentioned Goldhagen. Let's hover on that for a second. Daniel Goldhagen wrote a famous book called Hitler's Willing Executioners. But I do recall the debate around that. To what extent were the German people and others in Eastern Europe, exterminationist in their anti-Semitism, or was it more eliminationist, or just we don't like Jews? Because the kind of more moderate anti-Semitism goes back centuries. Mm-hmm. But that doesn't mean people actually want to kill Jews on some mass thing. So there's some transition there. And here you get to the problem of interpretation. How do you know what's in people's hearts? We know what they do, but it's hard to say what their motive is when they act. If the Nazis are running the show and you can't speak out because you see what happens to your neighbors, they disappear. Well, you're just going to keep your mouth shut and sort of go along with it. And then decades later, somebody says, you knew about it and you were willing, you were a willing executioner of Hitler. It's like, well, how do you kind of read those kind of interpretations?
It's extremely complicated. And I think the most recent scholarly literature on this tries to show that people are complicated. And it's the same with the scholarship on rescuers, for example. There is no altruistic personality, just as there is no, with the exception of a few psychopaths, there is no exterminationist individual. So it's not just that people hold an ideology or of one sort or another. It's also that people change over time depending on the circumstances that they're in. So people, and we can trace this over with many examples, whether you're talking about high-level clergymen, for example, or Ukrainian peasants. They could do a good act one day with respect to their Jewish neighbors, and a bad act the next, and might not even be able to explain themselves why they've done what they've done. So the question of anti-Semitism there is too blunt an instrument, I think. That Goldhagen's argument was about Germans, not about Eastern Europeans. This is one of the problems with the book, that it was about Germans, and how, in his interpretation, Germans had effectively absorbed anti-Semitism with their mother's milk. And that the German population, as such, was characterized by what he calls eliminationist anti-Semitism, as he said. And the problem is that it's kind of instinctively appealing because it's a nice, simple explanation for the Holocaust, but it ignores all the psephological statistics, the fact that the Nazi Party never won a majority in a free election, the fact that the first victims of the Nazis were political opponents, suggesting that there was actually a large body of anti-Nazi Germans, as there remained in exile and at home, people who were imprisoned in prisons and concentration camps, or kept their heads down, and so on. So then the question is, well, how can we make sense of what people did more generally? And again, I think you have to divide this up. It's easier in a sense to look at the leading Nazis and see how their statements relate to their actions. The same is true of leaders of Axis countries that also took part in the Holocaust. If you look at the actions of Tiso's government in Slovakia, or Antonescu's in Romania, Horthy in Hungary in 1944, you can say, okay, these are people who make quite clearly anti-Semitic statements and who then take part in this project to kill the Jews. And there's a kind of clear correlation there. But when you're looking at the actions of, let's say, Dutch civil servants, drawing up lists of people and providing the SS with lists of Jews, are they anti-Semites? Or are they just behaving like professional civil servants? And the same is true with, let's say, Poles who were scared because the occupation of Poland was brutal, who might have refused. I'm not talking about people who, the so-called Schmalzowniki, who betrayed Jews to the Gestapo. I'm talking about ordinary people who might not have helped Jews, even though they sometimes had the opportunity to do so, because they were quite justifiably scared for themselves and their families. That might have been interpreted by Jewish victims as anti-Semitism, but it wasn't necessarily. And so I think these things have to be addressed in the very particular context in which we're examining.
Yeah, for sure. I remember after Schindler's List came out, Thomas Keneally was on a lecture tour. He came to Occidental College where I was teaching at the time. And so I went to hear him speak. And, at the time, Schindler was portrayed as this almost Mother Teresa, like Martin Luther King Jr. And Keneally said, he's not that kind of guy at all. It's just, he was morally questionable, could have gone this way, could have gone that way. But, the circumstances of the war, he went left instead of right. He did this instead of that. And boom, he ends up doing the right thing. But had there not been a war, he might have just been a marginally moral business person who was cutting corners and doing this and that, like, lots of people do, and nothing special.
Yes, exactly so. I mean, actually, his Schindler's camp was one of the sub-camps of Gross Rosen. So it was, formally affiliated to the concentration camp system. And I think it's fairly clear that he progressed over time into a rescuer of Jews. And there was a certain amount of self-interest in there because it kept his factory going. But he nevertheless did it. And I don't think it's because he was a Philo-Semite or suddenly had an outbreak of humanitarianism after years, as you say, of being, fairly run-of-the-mill, profit-oriented businessman. He probably himself couldn't explain why he chose those decisions.
Yeah, I think a lot of human psychology turns out to be like that. We try to predict human behavior. Social scientists are really actually quite bad at this. And it's possible that the people themselves don't know why they do things, right? You ask anybody, why did you do this? And they'll come up with an explanation. But these are ad hoc, after the fact justifications. And we know the parts of the brain that light up from these split brain experiments, where people are just making stuff up because they don't know why they did it. They flash on one side of the brain in these split brain. A picture of a Coca-Cola, and the person gets up and goes over to the vending machine and gets a Coke. Why'd you do that? Well, it's hot and I was really thirsty. It's like, no, that isn't why you did it at all. And other examples. This book, Jesse Baring's book on suicide. Why do people commit suicide? Most of them, they don't themselves know why. And there's an actual database of people that attempt to kill themselves and fail. And so there's tons of interviews with them. And almost all of them say, I don't know what got over me. I just got up in the morning and went, this is it. And then thank God I failed, or somebody caught me or saved me or whatever. And, that's why we have that suicide hotline. So, trying to understand somebody like a Schindler or anybody involved, it's really hard to say, or the rescuers. Who knows why they did that, and it may just come down to, because I remember Phil Zimbardo was looking after his Stanford prison experiment. Then he did a whole thing on Heroes Project, and who helped the Jews during the Holocaust. And he starts to accumulate a database. But you're looking for, like, what are the 6 characteristics of people that helped? You could probably come up with a list, but it's not going to predict, like, okay, who in the next genocide is going to help? This is not going to predict who's going to do it. They themselves may not know until that day, what, I'm going to do this really good thing here. I don't know why. I'm just going to do it.
Exactly. I mean, even in cases that seem fairly open and shut, like the famous case of Le Chambon, the French village of the French Protestants who felt, because they were themselves had been a persecuted minority, that they decided they were going to help the Jews and protect them in their village. Well, okay, but not all French Protestants did the same thing. And of course, countries with majority Protestant populations did quite the opposite. So again, I think it's a kind of post hoc justification for a kind of communal effort that can be explained to some extent, but not really to our satisfaction.
Yeah. Yeah. Another subject I bring up a lot on this podcast is, human nature. I was reading Hugo Mercier's book, Not Born Yesterday. So his argument is against the kind of Tversky-Kahneman, people are naturally irrational and emotional. They make bad decisions. They use heuristics, and, we're driven by this kind of type 1 or system 1 rapid cognition, and we get fooled all the time. And Mercier and another group of psychologists say, well, no, hang on. Actually, people can be rational in the right context. So he points out, for example, like a study of cults. Who joins a cult? Well, most people don't join cults. We only hear about the ones that join, the Jim Jones and they drink the Kool-Aid, or the UFO cult, or the Scientology, or the Tinder swindlers, by their example. This Netflix special of these women, they got swindled by this guy. But what they don't show is, how many hundreds of women did he try this out on, and he got nowhere. They told him to fuck off or whatever, right? And, and the problem with, how do you apply this to Germans? Were Germans naturally anti-Semitic? Were they eliminationist extermination? Well, by the time anybody could try to let me rephrase it. By the time anybody realized what was really going to happen or what was happening, it's too late. They can't speak out. You just get locked up, or there's no free press. So you get this pluralistic ignorance. Maybe everybody thinks everybody else is going along with it, when in fact most of them are not. And you can't find out because there's no freedom of communication to find out. Actually, nobody supports this guy. Why are we doing this? Right. So then that complicates it. So
I think that's absolutely right. I mean, another key debate about this is whether the Third Reich was a terroristic dictatorship or a consensus dictatorship. That's to say, whether it was built with grassroots support or not. And the historians like Richard Evans and Ian Kershaw and others, I think, keep correctly reminding us that it was a regime based on terror. That exactly as you say, of course, there was no free press. There was very little access to information other than official information, and so you reach a stage where, in the end, even people who are instinctively anti-Nazi end up, in a sense, helping or contributing to the stability of the regime by putting their heads down and going along with things. And that's not necessarily a criticism. I think that's what most people would do in that situation. But it helps in a way to reinforce the sense that there is no alternative. The scholars like Peter Fritscher or Robert Galately and others who talk about this so-called voluntaristic turn, i.e. that the Nazi regime was driven by grassroots support, which I sympathize with to quite a large extent, nevertheless still has to take into account the fact that this was a society based on terror. That if you spoke out, if you were perceived to be one of the natural enemies of the pure folk, then you would be swept away. So a lot of people learn how to keep their heads down. I mean, just think about the number of homosexuals in any given population. The number of homosexuals incarcerated in concentration camps for being gay in the Third Reich was very, very small, which suggests that the majority of people who were gay simply kept their heads down, were utterly undemonstrative about their sexual preference.
Yeah. In terms of how democracies work for current events, what was the turning point where, I'm trying to remember the details. So Hitler comes to power in January of 1933, but he's not a dictator yet. There were several steps in there where Hindenburg makes him chancellor, but it could have been this other guy. I forget his name now. And it turned on the Reichstag fire. It was probably a false flag operation, something like that. It could have gone another way, maybe.
It could have done, because actually the first Hitler cabinet was full of members of the DNVP, so the German Nationalist People's Party, which was also an extreme right party, but not the Nazi party. It was a more traditional German nationalist party. And basically, Hitler was brought into power by the established elites of Weimar on the basis that they would tame him. And if you read the Times, London in 1933, you see the same argument. Herr Hitler is not a traditional politician, but as soon as he assumes the reins of power, his sphere of action will be circumscribed, and he'll learn to behave like those respectable politicians around him. And of course, it was a fatal mistake. He learned no such thing. And the Reichstag fire, I think, which actually probably was started by the Dutch communist Van der Lubbe, was, as you say, the turning point. So it was the opportunity for the Nazis to introduce the Enabling Act and the first of all the Reichstag Fire Act, which turned the country into a one-party state. Basically forbade all the freedoms of liberal democracy, freedom of the press, freedom of assembly, freedom of speech, and so on, and began the process of eliminating the other parties. So that's when you see the dictatorship building very, very quickly after that point. It's only a couple of months into the regime.
Right, pretty early on. So, game theorists have this idea called an escalation game where, just step by step, the further down the road you go, the harder it is to bail because you have sunk costs. You've gone this far, like Milgram's, 15 volts at a time. I don't really want to do this, but the guy's telling me I got to finish. Well, maybe it'll stop the next one, maybe the next one, maybe just one more. And before you know it, you're up to 350 volts or whatever. Mm-hmm. So, starting with the, passing of laws against the Jews to isolate them out of work and social life and so on. Are there turning points that are bigger steps, not just a escalator? There's bigger leaps along the way, maybe up to the Wannsee Conference?
Yes, there are. But again, the intentionalist argument doesn't quite capture why they exist in the way they do. So I think the first really important one is very quickly in 1933, the law on the restoration of the professional civil service, which contains the famous Aryan paragraph, which is those employees of the state who are of non-Aryan origin, with a few exceptions like decorated World War I veterans and so on, are to be removed from their posts. So you see civil servants removed, academics, lawyers, and so on, removed from their posts, either immediately or gradually over the next few years. The next really important turning point, and there's a huge slew of anti-Jewish laws in the 6 years running up to the war. The other really important one is the Nuremberg laws, of course. So the law for the protection of German blood and honor, and the flag law and so on. These are laws that the most important effect of which are to deprive German Jews of their citizenship. So they become effectively guests in they're subjects, not citizens. And a lot of people say, the Jews were kind of sanguine about this because they recognize this from 70 or 80 years previous. This is a return to the pre-emancipation world. But actually, I think that's really to underestimate the effects of this, because the German Jews felt themselves very strongly to be German. And the idea that they would be stripped of their citizenship was a huge attack on them, which is why, of course, half the German Jewish population leave the country before the outbreak of the war. The other really important, it's not a turning point so much as there's a few staging posts in this process, but it's often written out of the scholarship, apart from in the specialist scholarship, is the so-called Aryanization process. So the stripping from Jews of their property and businesses, and basically their impoverishment. So by the time that it reaches 1938-39, the remaining Jewish population is hanging on by a thread. They're reduced to spheres that are only Jewish schools, Jewish doctors. They're heavily dependent on Jewish philanthropy from richer members of the community. And everyone can see it's a community that's dying. And this is long before the Nazis have embarked on the process of genocide. So there is this kind of social death that takes place in a way that is extremely brutal, even though it's happening over a longer period. I always ask my students, did the attack on the Jews happen quickly or slowly? And they say well, slowly, because it takes between 1933 and 1939. And I say, yeah, well, wait till you're 52. And that period of 5 or 6 years will no longer seem, quite so long. I actually think it happens quite rapidly. The real turning point here, I think, that like the turn to violence comes with the November pogrom, or Kristallnacht. It's the first time that nationwide organized physical attacks on Jews take place. 30,000 Jewish men are briefly interned in concentration camps. Thereafter, the majority of the synagogues in Germany, including Austria by this point, are destroyed. And that is the kind of final warning to the German Jews that they really need to leave, which many tens of thousands do afterwards. You referred to Wannsee. I mean, the context for Wannsee is really different, because now it's in the context of the war. The first killing sprees have already taken place in the occupied Soviet Union in the summer of 1941. And Wannsee is interesting because, of course, the old intentionalist argument was this is where the decision for the final solution was made, and which is an argument that undermines itself, because if, as intentionalists argue, the Nazis had always intended to murder the Jews, why did they need a meeting in January 1942 to decide to murder the Jews, right? So the Wannsee Conference then looks, from today's perspective, somewhat different. And it is where a kind of decision-making is taking place. But what's happening there is that Heydrich has assembled, not all, but many of the key players from groups within the Nazi Party umbrella, but also from the state, from the civil service, the Ministry of Justice and so on, in order to coordinate them, as it were, and to get them to sign up to something that was already happening and that had already been approved. And there I would recommend the film Conspiracy, which is one of the few really good docudramas about the Holocaust. I can't think about Heydrich now without seeing Kenneth Branagh in the role. I mean, he's really chilling, and it's filmed in the Wannsee Villa in Berlin, and I think it's brilliant, because although, I mean, what we have from that conference is Eichmann's record, the so-called protocols. We don't have a verbatim transcript of what was said, and so that bit is made up. But it's all too believable that, when Heydrich goes for a little walk at lunchtime with, I can't remember whether it's Kritzinger or Stuckart, one of the representatives of the state, who's a little bit reluctant to sign up quite so enthusiastically, and he takes him for a little walk and says, we have meat hooks for people who resist us. It's exactly the kind of thing you can imagine Heydrich saying. So his friends,
right?
And this is it's really very chilling.
And Eichmann was there too, right?
Yes, Eichmann was taking the minutes.
There, yeah.
He took the minutes. Yeah, exactly.
Like a good bureaucrat that he was.
Yeah, indeed.
Yeah, I want to ask you about Hannah Arendt in a minute, but just first, if the Nazi regime is a terrorist state that can do pretty much anything it wants, why are they bothering to pass laws?
That is a very good question. Because it's a modern state, I think. And so although the Reichstag, the parliament, is basically suspended, it assumes a decorative function only. So, for example, Hitler's famous speech of the 30th of January 1939, where he talks about the, if the international Jew unleashes another world war, the result will not be the Bolshevization of the earth, but the annihilation of the Jewish race in Europe. That's one moment in actually a very long, like 3.5-hour speech or something. But that was one of only 5 or 6 occasions throughout the whole 12 years of the Third Reich when the Reichstag was reassembled. Nevertheless, the Reichsgesetzblatt, the legal publication, not the legal code, the publication of newly announced laws that every state produces, was produced throughout the 12 years of the Third Reich. And so, in a sense, as Hans Frank said, Hitler's word is law. So there is this facade of legality, all of these, and there are all these differences between decrees, announcements, laws, with subtle differences about who could make these particular statements. But all of these laws that get passed, i.e. decreed by Hitler, appear in the Reich legal code, which continues to be published, like as in any other state. I think, again, we come back to this problem of a kind of the mysticism and the modernity. mysticism as part of modernity. The Germany is a modern state. It has, when Max Weber was writing about the civil service in the early years of the 20th century, he was writing in his words about an ideal type. But what he was really describing was the Prussian civil service. This extraordinarily effective, professional civil service, acting, as he put it, sine ira et studio, without anger, without passion, simply doing its job, without anyone getting hot under the collar. And you can see that continues to exist in Nazi Germany. Most of the ordinary aspects of life continued to operate. Neighbors still had disputes that went to court over, boundary disputes or whatever. All of these kind of regular stuff, the functioning of any modern state, continued to exist.
Yeah, I wonder to what extent that can then be used against people who are dissenting or uncomfortable with the genocide as it's unfolding. You could just say, well, this is the law of the land. We're just following not just what the boss says, working toward the Fuhrer. I forget who said that phrase. But actually just following the law. And didn't the people like Goering at the Nuremberg trials make that very argument? Like, within the state, we were doing what the legal system said we had to do.
Yes. It was thrown out at Nuremberg. That was the classic Nuremberg argument.
Right.
This has become since a crucial component of international law, that this notion of simply following orders is not really good enough. That's a mass crime that contravenes natural justice, and for which you should have exercised your judgment and thought, no, that's not right. It's not a good enough defense. But absolutely, that's.
Hey, what's a guy going to do? They said to kill 6 million people. What are you going to do? Yeah. So, to what extent was the Western world aware of these step-by-step, United States, Britain, and so on, along the way in the 30s? You hear this debate. Roosevelt knew about it, but didn't want to do anything because he was anti-Semitic, or the administration was anti-Semitic, or maybe they just couldn't do anything about it. There's only so much you can do.
It's a very complicated question. From before the Nazis came to power, there was already a large literature on fascism, since Mussolini came to power in 1922, but a large literature in the press and by commentators writing books about the Hitler phenomenon. And 20 years ago, I published a book called Responses to Nazism in Britain, 1933 to 39, which also included American writers, but books that were published in the UK as well by American scholars and travelers and journalists and so on. And what was interesting in doing the research for that book was the discovery of the absolute mountain of stuff that was published in the 1930s, but of all shades. Some apologetic. The apologists were in the minority, but were quite vocal. But people of all offering all sorts of opinions as to what this all meant and whether Hitler should be taken seriously. Was it a threat to the British Empire? What was important, and what was often important in the 30s was the attack on religion rather than the attack on the Jews. The idea of Nazism as a kind of godlessness, paganism, attacking Christian civilization was very important, particularly to the Church of England. And so again, you have, I think, to ask who knew what at what point, and be very careful about differentiating different groups and their access to knowledge. Because in the 30s, the Nazis themselves advertised their concentration camps, for example. When Dachau was the first of the major concentration camps to be created in 1933. And the Nazi press was full of it. And the Nazis went to great lengths also to advertise it internationally, to say, look, we're cleaning up our society, we're creating jobs, we're sweeping the scum off the street. And this was quite well received in the international press. When it comes to 1940, 41 onwards, and the killing process, again, the question is, the question of anti-Semitism is too blunt. If you're talking about the Roosevelt administration, it's simply too blunt to say, was Roosevelt an anti-Semite or not? It doesn't really get you very far. You have to ask which part of the administration had access to what knowledge and what did they do. So there are arguments that different offices within the administration had different values, and some you can find anti-Semitic statements being made by certain civil servants in the US, as you can in Britain, but you can also find the opposite. So it's very much a case of identifying who knew what when, and looking at the specific culture within, let's say, the War Office or the War Refugee Board or whatever it might be. But the question, the separate question you asked, which is about whether it was possible to do more, that's I think a separate argument, and there's been a huge literature, as you know, on whether the Allies should have bombed Auschwitz and so on, and a lot of the blaming that's been placed on the Allies is a kind of post-war moral attempt to kind of morally repair this sense of guilt for not having done more, when actually the argument of the Allies at the time, which was we can only stop this by winning the war, is, I think, not entirely without merit.
Yeah, just bring it to an end sooner to save even more Jews that way. The bombing of Auschwitz, yeah, I remember reading about that at the time when I was writing Denying History, because Alex Groban, my co-author, and I, we went to Yad Vashem, and we got the aerial photographs, actually the canisters of film that were shot from B-17 bombers. And there's one where you can see the bombs dropping and right over Auschwitz. And people think, well, look, they did try to bomb Auschwitz, but actually the plane's, going 400 miles an hour this way, so the bomb is going to drop that way, and it was going to the IG Farben plant 3 kilometers away or whatever it was. And it's like, but then when you read the analysis of mass bombings that was done after the Second World War, like how effective was it really to bomb Dresden and Hamburg and all, or these specified targets? We're going to, bomb that ball bearing plant. First of all, it's not targeted like AI smart weapons we have today. They're just carpet bombing and hope you hit something. But even the ones that hit, I guess the Germans got these plants back up and running pretty quickly. So it's not clear to me that had they bombed the railway spurs into Auschwitz, Birkenau, it would have made any difference. They could have just had those trains back up in a couple of days.
I agree. I mean, I think probably it was technically possible. Like the photographs you're referring to show, as you say, the attempt to bomb the Farben plant, Auschwitz III, Monowitz, right, which was part of the Auschwitz complex. But as you say, the photograph, it looks like the bombs are dropping on Birkenau, or Auschwitz II, which was the main extermination camp. And if they could drop bombs on Auschwitz III, they probably also could drop bombs on Auschwitz II. But one of the things I wanted to show in my book, of course, is that, as you said at the start, half of the victims of the Holocaust were not killed in death camps. And so, okay, let's say that the gas chambers were knocked out of operation, doesn't mean that the Nazis couldn't kill Jews. And that the fact that they wanted to until the very end.
Yeah, that like over half the Jews killed were already killed by the time Auschwitz opened the first, Birkenau opened the first gas chambers and
this statistic comes from Christopher Browning, which he cites in the preface to Ordinary Men. Right. He says that in March 1942, 80% of the victims of the Holocaust were still alive, whereas by March 1943, 80% of the victims of the Holocaust were dead. And 1942 is the year in which the gas chambers, the first 2 gas chambers at Auschwitz-Birkenau, start to operate. But it's also from 1941 through 1942, you see approximately 1.5 million Jews shot in face-to-face killings in pits outside their hometowns in the Western Soviet Union. You see some tens of thousands dying in the ghettos of Nazi-occupied Poland, and you see the Jews of the general government being killed in the Operation Reinhard death camps, Belzec, Sobibor, and Treblinka. And those camps, although they were able to kill people at an extremely rapid rate, were not the kind of technologically efficient factory line genocide institutions that they've been portrayed as. I mean, they killed people with an internal combustion engine. It's about as brutal as you can think, and as primitive as you can imagine.
Yeah, there's those secret photographs at Birkenau of them burning bodies off on the side. Presumably, the crematoria broke down because they were
exactly. Yeah. It's in the summer of 1944. It's after the killing of the Jews of Hungary, when so many Jews were being killed. Exactly as you say, that the crematoria broke down, and so they were burning bodies out in the open.
So you make a statement in your book about that they could not have done that without some collaboration of the local peoples in these non-German areas or German-occupied areas, that, like in Poland. By the way, because you mentioned that law that you can't say that the Poles had anything to do with the Holocaust. I accidentally posted on just a tweet saying something like the Polish death camps, and oh boy, I got a lot of heat. Okay, I meant the death camps in Poland, not the Polish Poland. Yes, yeah, exactly. I can see why they're sensitive to that. But what you're saying is that the SS and so on, they couldn't have done this by themselves. The locals at least knew about it or allowed it, or maybe even helped. Or I mean, what's your sense of that?
Again, it's important to differentiate and to be clear about where you're talking about and when. So there is no uniform pattern across Europe.
Yeah.
And firstly, I think it's very important to say, I'm not trying to overstate this significance. I do have a chapter in the book which is about the continent-wide crime of the Holocaust, where I want to talk about the significance of collaboration. And I'm going to elaborate on this. I'm going to write more about the Holocaust in Romania, which is, I think, a sui generis case. But it nevertheless remains the case that the vast majority of Jews murdered in the Holocaust were killed by Germans, by which I mean also Austrians. So, Germans in the context of the Third Reich. So even where local collaborators were involved, let's say in Hungary in the spring of 1944, Eichmann's Sonderkommando, or his special squad of a couple of hundred men, could not on its own have deported 437,000 Jews to Auschwitz in the space of a couple of months. They relied very heavily on the Hungarian police to assist them. Nevertheless, it wasn't the Hungarian police who killed them. They were then deported to Birkenau, where about a third were shipped off for slave labor, but the rest were murdered. But they were killed there by Germans. The same was often true in the shootings. So we know that there were lots of auxiliaries, Ukrainians, Latvians, and so on, involved in assisting the killings. Nevertheless, the majority of shooters were Germans. So it's really important to distinguish between different people and different places. There are regimes, like Quisling's regime in Norway, Vichy France, Tiso's Slovakia, Pavelich's Croatia, and so on, where you can say at the level of the state, there's a collaboration with the Third Reich, and there's also a coincidence of wants, in the sense that these are regimes that also believe in ethnic homogeneity, racial purity, and use the opportunity of the German project to get rid of their Jews. So the Slovakians, for example, are quite entrepreneurial, and they start to petition the Third Reich to take their Jews before they've even been requested to do so. Others are a bit slower on the uptake. And of course, in the case of Italy, there's kind of resistance for all sorts of reasons. Then we can go down to the level of institutions, like auxiliary police battalions and so on, SS regiments. Every country in Europe, including Albania, Serbia, and so on, had an SS regiment, with the exception of Poland, because Poland as a place was supposed to be wiped off the map. And then you can go down to the level of individuals. So I already referred earlier to, let's say, Ukrainian peasants looting the houses of their Jewish neighbors who'd been shot. Doesn't make them eliminationist anti-Semites. It makes them poor and opportunists. And what did they get from their Jewish neighbors' houses? A few pots and pans and some blankets, some cutlery or whatever. It's of course we can say, well, that was wrong, but it's not the same as collaboration, in the sense that, because the problem with that word is that it's associated with, it comes from the French context. We think of resistance and collaboration in the context of France, and it's a very loaded term, but I chose to use it anyway because I think I couldn't think of a better one, and it speaks to the experience of different groups of people in at different times. The really key example for me is, sorry, go on. Go ahead.
No, go ahead, please.
I was going to say that the really key example for me is Romania, because it's different from France or Norway or Croatia, in the sense that Romania is not a puppet state created by the Nazis. It's an independent state allied to Nazi Germany, which has considerable leverage over Germany, precisely because the Germans need Romanian oil. And so the diplomatic relations between the two countries are not exactly those of equals, but not far off. And what you see in Romania and under Antonescu is the coming to power of basically a fascist, authoritarian come fascist regime, which and Antonescu is a virulent anti-Semite, not quite as obsessed with the Jews as a world historical phenomenon as Hitler is, but he wants to get rid of the Jews from Romania and from the Romanian acquired territories. And so this is why the Romanian army is the third largest force that invades the Soviet Union, along with the Hungarians and the Italians and so on, in the spring of 1941. And it's why the Jews of the newly acquired regions of Romania after World War I, northern Bukovina and Bessarabia, are deported to Transnistria. This is the area of Ukraine occupied by Romania, where they're dumped, left to fend for themselves in sub-zero temperatures, and then subjected to massacres in the winter of 1941-42, where the Romanians kill. The numbers are very difficult to establish, but somewhere, let's say, around about 350,000 Jews. And then, in the autumn of 1942, Antonescu changes his mind, basically for strategic reasons, because he can see which way the wind is blowing in terms of the war. He doesn't deport the Jews from the so-called Regat, or the old kingdom of Romania. The Jews of the Banat in western Romania are not deported. And so by the end of the war, the same regime that's responsible for killing about 350 Jews has also protected what is the largest surviving population group of Jews remaining in Europe in 1945. And so, things are not morally black and white. I mean, Antonescu was executed as a war criminal quite correctly, but the argument of his apologists that he was a savior of Jews is also true. Just conveniently forgetting the first bit.
Yes, yeah. I was thinking about that with reading this book, Operation Paperclip, about how the United States got as many Nazi scientists as they possibly could before the Russians got them. And a lot of these guys were, they could have been on. They could have been in Nuremberg being tried for war crimes, but instead they're living in Ohio working for NASA or whatever.
Yeah,
it's like, oh, that was back then. Let's just look forward, right?
But the failure to identify collaboration also had some very important effects after the war, like the admission of Ukrainians and Latvians and Hungarians and others with dubious pasts into the UK, Canada, the US, Australia. So the whole the Nachtigall, or the Nightingale battalion, the Ukrainian SS battalion, large numbers of them admitted to the UK after the war. David Cesarani wrote about this at length in his Justice Delayed book. Because it was the SS that was a proscribed organization, and the Allies. I mean, the Allies had a lot to do, but they didn't really notice the fact that there were local fascist organizations that were also deeply committed to this same project.
On this question of who knew what when and what could they do about it anyway, the Catholic Church, Italy, Germany, and other areas. What are your thoughts on that?
I'm not an expert on the church, but I think Saul Friedlander is very good on the church, and again, it's a lot of focus has been on the Pope, on Pius XII, and not helped by the fact that the Vatican has been very reluctant until recently to open its archives, and there's still one bit of the Vatican archive that is not yet open fully to historians. So there's still, a sense that there's stuff to hide. But when you look at the church more broadly, the picture again becomes grey rather than black and white. So Pius XII might look. The Pope is supposed to be God's emissary on earth. He's not supposed to be frightened of speaking out in front of earthly powers, and he could have said more. It's true he made various veiled references, attacked notions of eugenics and race science and so on. Okay. He could have been more explicit. I think that's probably a reasonable point. At the same time, as many other historians have shown, even within the Vatican itself, in Vatican City, there were clergymen who were rescuing Jews. And so the actions of individual Catholics vary massively. In Croatia and in Slovakia, we have two regimes that are usually referred to as clerico-fascist. Tiso was a priest, the Catholic Church was deeply bound up with this notion of ethnic homogeneity in those places. In Romania, again, the role of the Orthodox Church was the subject of a recent book by a historian called Jan Popper. And it was also strongly bound up with the regime because Romanian fascism identified Romanianness with orthodoxy. And so the church's role in all of this is, let's say, mixed, shall we say.
Yeah, wasn't there some religious criticisms of the Nazi regime in Germany with the euthanasian program? And that's about the time when Himmler said, all right, we're not going to put any of this in writing, and we're going to move this out of Germany and into these other territories so that, that we're not as directly connected to it and it's not as obvious to the locals what's going on here, something like that.
Yes. There's a famous sermon by Bishop van Galen of Münster who protested against the euthanasia program, rightly pointing out, saying, well, if we're killing people because they're disabled, what are we going to do with our soldiers who come home from the war disfigured, having lost limbs and so on? Are we going to put them down? These sorts of arguments. It wasn't an argument because the euthanasia program didn't target Jews as such. It was not an argument about Jews. It was an argument about the Aryan society. Nevertheless, a very strong criticism of the euthanasia program. And so from shortly after that point, it was officially halted, but it continued in secret. So later, the killing of children in asylums and so on, and later the so-called Operation 14F13, which was the killing of disabled patients in concentration camps and so on, continued to take place. And as we know, many of the personnel and the technology, the gassing technology that was used in the Reinhard camps to kill Jews originally came from the euthanasia program. So it was developed first in that context of euthanasia.
Well, I was just thinking about this. Back to dealing with the Holocaust deniers. David Irving famously said, "I'll give you $1,000 if you can show me the order from Hitler to exterminate the Jews." But so how do you deal with this? There's this working toward the Führer again. I forget who
Kershaw
gave that phrase. Yeah. So everybody knows what the boss wants. He doesn't need to put it in writing. And what good would that do anyway? You just pass it along secretly. Something like that. That was what, late 30s when that started happening. Just the kind of secrecy of it. Don't put it in writing.
I think that what happened with the criticism of the euthanasia program is the one major time when Hitler gets his fingers burnt, in a sense, because there is an official order for the euthanasia program, and there isn't one it's a simple one-sentence order. There's nothing like that for the murder of the European Jews. Nevertheless, there is a huge body of documentation that shows that order existed in a sense, from the Wannsee protocols to Goering's authorization to Heydrich, etc., Himmler's speeches, all sorts of things.
Yes, right. Goebbels' diary.
Yes. Goebbels at one point in his diary says, the Führer said that if the Jew unleashed World War, the result would be the annihilation of the Jewish race in Europe, and now it's coming true. So, and Jeffrey Hirsch's book, The Jewish Enemy, goes into great detail to show how throughout the war, and actually paradoxically towards the end of the war, the restatement of that policy and that claim of Hitler's becomes more and more shrill on the airwaves and in the wall posters and so on. The sense of, as Germany heads for collapse, that the propaganda becomes more crazed in terms of warning the German people that the revenge of the Jews is coming, even though the Jews of Europe are dead at that point.
Yeah, okay, back to Christopher Browning's book, Ordinary Men. So, he debunks the myth that these German soldiers had to go through with this or else they would have been executed or punished or whatever. That's not true.
Correct.
They were given the option to not participate in these shootings, these mass shootings. Okay, so it's the Einsatzgruppen and Special Action Forces following the Wehrmacht into Ukraine and so on. And their job is to kill every Jew in the town. And so the boss tells them, this is what we're doing tomorrow. You don't have to do it if you don't want. And I guess most of them did it. So the question is it because they wanted to do it, or is like, well, everybody else is doing it, I don't want to appear weak or whatever. There was like social pressure or something like that, even though you could. It's like everybody lined up. Okay, step forward if you don't want to participate. Well, you go first, right? So you have, maybe that's a social cycle. I just don't know how to read that. These are so-called ordinary men, right? They're in their 30s. They're not young teenagers or in their early 20s. So presumably they have a little bit more of a moral compass. But I don't know. How do you read that?
Well, Browning is writing about Ordinary Police Battalion 101. And so the order police, the Ordnungspolizei, are not the Einsatzgruppen. These are basically kind of regular reserve policemen who've been called up. And in the case that he studies, and Goldhagen looked at the same group but came to different conclusions, but this group of men, actually they were older, they were mostly in their 40s. They're from Hamburg, famously a social democratic city. They'd been socialized and schooled under Weimar. They had come of age in modern parliamentary democratic Germany. And yet, the vast majority of them turned into mass murderers. And, well, I think you know more about it. You know the social psychological literature better than I do, but I'm tempted to make the claim that human beings kill other human beings when they can get away with it, because they like it. And it's I'm not saying I want to or you want to, but in certain circumstances, when given that chance and placed in a position where, as you say, it's difficult to stand out without being embarrassed about saying, yeah, I don't really want to do that people will do it. You can see the same thing in Rwanda, for example, during the genocide in 1994, that the mobilization of locals by Hutu power governors at local level rounded people up, and it was very difficult to not take part. And then later on, when reflecting on what they'd done, many of the killers said, it was like a moment out of time. I can't explain what happened in that period. I wasn't really myself, etc., etc. And I think something similar helps to explain the role of the order police, because, again, with the exception of a few psychopaths, they are totally ordinary people who reflect on the fact that they've got children back home and so on. What I would say is that one of the criticisms of Browning's book was that it downplayed the role of ideology. I think that's a little bit unfair, because he sets out this consensus framework of ideology, but then says, okay, we'll take that for granted. But actually, it could be emphasized more. And so I had a PhD student, Ian Rich, some years ago, whose book has subsequently been published, where what he did was to look at two other order police battalions and showed, as in the case of Nazism more generally, he showed that what was important was not the rank and file, but the leadership. And that the leadership of these order police battalions, they were basically born within a year or two of each other. They all attended the same training school in Berlin-Köpenick, where they received heavy doses of ideological indoctrination. And again, it was the leadership stratum that mattered. And there's also an interesting book on the Wehrmacht by a historian called Bryce Sate, where he shows a similar kind of thing, that the levels of ideological indoctrination and training reached such a point that after a while, it no longer needed to be said. And so this kind of tacit understanding, we can see at the level of the state, Hitler no longer needed to say it because it was the party program, everybody knew. And at the level of individual battalions and regiments and so on, everybody knew. They'd all had this ideological training. And so whether they bought into it or not, that was the framework.
Yeah, common knowledge. I know that you know that I know.
Yes.
Yeah, I was just pulling up a quote here from a book called The Good Old Days, The Holocaust as Seen by its Perpetrators and Bystanders. So in an emotional, here, I'll just read this part. In an emotional personal letter to his wife, this Lieutenant Colonel Karl Kretschmer apologizes for not writing more, but he notes he's feeling ill and in low spirits because I'd like to be with you all. What you see here makes you either brutal or sentimental. His gloomy mood, he explains, is caused by the sight of the dead, including women and children. Which dead? Dead Jews. Quote, as the war is, in our opinion, a Jewish war, the Jews are the first to feel it. Here in Russia, wherever the German soldier is, no Jew remains.
Mm-hmm.
You can imagine that at first I needed some time to get to grips with this. And in a subsequent letter, not dated, he explains to his wife that there's no room for pity of any kind. You women and children back home could not expect any mercy or pity if the enemy got the upper hand. For that reason, we are mopping up where necessary, but otherwise, the Russians are willing, simple, and obedient. There are no Jews here anymore. Wow. And there's a lot of letters like that.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
I'm advancing my career. I'm out here working hard.
Yeah. But they, and some of them reflect on the fact that they have children and then say, oh, but we have to do this to protect our children from these Asiatic barbarians and so on. Obviously, not every member of the Einsatzgruppen or the Order Police or the Wehrmacht wrote such letters or thought along the same lines. But one of the things that the so-called Wehrmacht exhibition of the 1990s showed was that even 50 years after the end of the war, ordinary German families could still find in their dad's or granddad's Wehrmacht uniform hanging in the attic photographs of war crimes, and that these exist in the tens of thousands, even though photography of that nature was officially forbidden.
Mm-hmm. Here's another one. If it weren't for the stupid thoughts about what we're doing in this country, the Einsatz here would be wonderful, since it has put me in a position where I can support you all very well. Since, as I already wrote to you, I consider the last Einsatz to be justified, and indeed approve of the consequences it had, the phrase stupid thoughts is not strictly accurate. Rather, it is a weakness not to be able to stand the side of dead people. The best way of overcoming it is to do it more often, then it becomes a habit. Unbelievable. But that's, so the psychological effect there is habituation. Like you're probably not aware of the shirt you're wearing or the ring on your hand. But there's moral habituation. You get used to evil and you don't even notice it if it's gradual enough, and then you get used to it.
Mm-hmm. Yes, routinization, I suppose, is also one of the terms the social psychologists use, isn't it?
Yeah. Right. So what is your take then on Hannah Arendt's take on Eichmann and the banality of evil and all that? Was she too... I don't know. Did she let him off the hook a little bit? He was more of an anti-Semite than she gave him.
I don't think she let him off the hook. I mean, I know it's the case that Hannah Arendt still divides people in a kind of violent way. There are people who love her or hate her, and I fall into the former category. I think she's one of the great writers of the 20th century, and that particularly Origins of Totalitarianism is whatever you think about it. It's brilliant to think with, and the Eichmann book, I mean, it was one of the reasons it pissed people off so much, I think, was because of her tone rather than what she said. It was the way she said it, and I think she quite enjoyed that, actually. That she enjoyed getting under people's skin in that way, and she was also a little bit disingenuous when she says about it. This is just a trial report. Yeah, it's a little bit more than a trial report. This is, an exercise in moral philosophy and political theory and so on. When I think the historians, like David Cesarani or like Bettina Stangnet and others who've written on Eichmann and argued that he was much more of a committed ideologue than he claimed about himself, and that Arendt thought, are correct, except to say that I think she knew this. I mean, the writings, the interviews that he'd given to what's his name, the Dutch neo-Nazi who took down did interviews with him whilst he was still in hiding in Argentina, show that. The interviews with him in Jerusalem show that. Where I think, and she really nailed him, when he tried to cite Kant's categorical imperative in order to justify his own actions, and she said, this is utter stupidity. Okay, so he wasn't a philosopher. He was, of course, highly committed. But I think that the banality of evil has been misunderstood as a description of the Holocaust. And it's quite clear from everything she ever wrote that she did not think the Holocaust was banal. It's meant as a description of Eichmann himself. And in that sense, I think it's not unjustifiable, in the sense that he presented in Jerusalem as very ordinary. Okay, he had been a committed ideologue and still was quite clearly. And when you think about the things he said at his trial and before he was executed and so on, nevertheless, the banality, that's to say, she talks about his inability to think, and in that sense, I think she was right that he committed himself to this project, and never had the wherewithal, like Speer, for example, to think it through and to say, maybe, was I right to do that? And in that sense, I think banality of evil retains some bite.
Yeah. I guess, yeah, I think I agree with that. It's that you expect a monster when you see him, and it looks like, well, this guy's just kind of a boring looking bureaucrat sitting there in instead of his uniform, he's just got this coat and tie and whatever. Yeah, I guess that's that kind of moralization gap that Roy Baumeister talks about in his book Evil. You expect the perpetrator, the difference between the perpetrator and the victim, from the victim's perspective, the perpetrator is truly evil to have done this. They must be just horrible through and through. And then it turns out they're not. They're just like a regular guy, except they did this bad thing. And so you get that huge gap between, what we expect it to look like and what it actually is. And again, it gets to this too much black and white thinking and moralizing about it. So much of the Holocaust literature is moralizing. I'm glad to see it's much more clinical in a way, or scholarly or whatever. To get away from it. It's easy to moralize about how bad it is. Who would argue otherwise? But why did it happen, and in what way, and this circumstance, everything we've been talking about today.
Yes,
I think is important. Another thing I learned from your book that I always never quite understood, why the Nazis would allocate so much resources, particularly as the war was turning against them. But they didn't. It wasn't that much of their overall GDP of the Reich. I was astonished by that.
No, they devote a tiny amount of resource to it, and I can't remember off the top of my head the railway statistics, but the total number of trains used to deport the Jews from across Europe to Auschwitz is a fraction of 1 day's rail travel across the German Empire, and so it's this idea that the Nazis contributed to their own defeat by carrying out the Holocaust, I think is very easy to debunk empirically. The camps themselves, we have the kind of famous Bauhaus entrance to Birkenau, but most of the camps were kind of jerry-built, on local stuff that was snaffled and flung together. So, yeah, it was a very simple operation. And when we think about the Einsatzgruppen, all we're talking about is bullets.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, pretty cheap to make. Yeah. Another eye-opener book for me was Robert Jan van Pelt and Deborah Dvorak's book on Auschwitz. And you think of it, Auschwitz is just so massive in our imagination. It's this clinical death camp, but that wasn't what it was designed to do initially. So talk about that. That would be the kind of functionalist. It started off as this and it ended up as that.
All of the concentration camps change over time. That's also extremely important. So I think when we think about what Belsen looked like in 1945 when it was liberated, this kind of huge town of this deathscape, 10,000 corpses and 50,000 dying people, it hadn't looked like that a year earlier. It's completely different. And so, again, you have to say, which camp are we talking about, when? And they were always changing. And so Auschwitz, by the end of the war, was a huge complex of Auschwitz I, the main camp, Auschwitz II, Birkenau, the extermination camp, Auschwitz III, Monowitz. And Monowitz was itself the center of the Auschwitz, the bigger Auschwitz slave labor project that ran about 100 subcamps, these so-called satellite camps. Most of the names of which have been forgotten, places like Neudax or Eintrachthütte or Janina Gruber. These are very small camps, often no more than 200, 300, 400 inmates at any one time, but they could be also brutal, and lots of people died in them. And by the end of the war, there were something like over 1,000, maybe 1,100 subcamps attached to the main concentration camps. And that's not even to mention the camps for forced laborers and criminals and all sorts of people attached to firms and town councils across the whole of Germany. So Auschwitz changed. Auschwitz I was set up as a concentration camp effectively for Polish political prisoners. And there were some Jews among them, but they were not initially sent there as Jews. They were sent there as political members of the resistance and so on. And it developed over time, so that when Birkenau was built, it was in the context of debates about how to transition from the killing by bullets to gas chambers. And when Auschwitz III was built, this is in the context of the SS's, the creation of the so-called Business Main Administration Office, the WVHA, which was an organization within the SS umbrella, and the attempt by the SS to run a huge business on the basis of slave labor. So it's changing all the time.
Yeah. I was also amazed at how many of camps there were that you never even heard of. There's like thousands of them, right? Or hundreds.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, hundreds of satellite camps. Some of them we have heard of, like Schindler's camp that we mentioned before. That's one that we've heard of. And there might be others that often these are names that people might recognize from reading memoirs. So if you read memoirs by survivors, often they survived because they were transferred from one small camp to another in the late stages of the war. So let's say a Jew deported from Hungary in the spring of 1944, or from what remained of the Łódź ghetto in the summer of 1944. If they were young and fit enough, they might have been registered in Auschwitz, that then immediately sent off to one of the subcamps of Auschwitz, or of Gross-Rosen, or of Buchenwald, or of Neuengamme, where they worked usually in aviation, producing plane parts, bullets, whatever weaponry it was, or often, at the end of the war, sent to what became the last autonomous camp, which was Dora Mittelbau, which was the site of the underground production of the V2 rockets, which was based on massively destructive slave labor. I mean, the death rate in Dora Mittelbau is really horrific because of the conditions in these tunnels, breathing in noxious fumes and being underfed and living in these horrible freezing, dank conditions and so on.
Yeah, I just don't think there's any way that Werner von Braun could not have known about that. Later he kind of washed his hands of the whole thing, but if he was operating now, he probably would not be working for NASA.
I hope not.
But But the other thing about your book, again, that I just didn't know that much about is the Holocaust didn't end in 1945. It really continues at least until, 1957 with the displaced persons. In a way, Hitler was rather successful at it. There was 9.5 million Jews before and, less than 3 million afterwards. And they mostly had nowhere to go. So they went to Israel and the United States, whatever.
I mean, there were small Jewish population groups obviously in Britain, in Switzerland, in Romania, who survived or were not involved in the war. But they were a minority. And exactly as you say, many of the Jews ended up in displaced persons camps in Germany and Austria, and to a smaller extent in Italy after the war, where they assumed that, having been the victims of the Nazi regime, the Allies would then help them to either go home or be resettled somewhere else. And that actually wasn't the case. And so it took the British mandate in Palestine was only admitting 1,500 Jews per month. The Americans didn't amend the DP Act until 1948 in the first instance, and then 1950 again to allow Jews in. And by the time they did so in 1950, of course, it was kind of cynical because they knew that most of the Jews by then had left for Israel. So there were large numbers of Jews who left for Israel in 1948 as a kind of stepping stone, who didn't necessarily want to stay. And so in the end, a large number of Jews did end up in the United States, and quite small numbers in Britain, but larger numbers in Australia and Canada and South America and elsewhere. But it was a very, very long process. And as you say, the last DP camp in Fürstenwald outside Munich didn't close until 1957. And that was largely because there was a group, the so-called hardcore of DPs, who were either too old or too ill to travel, as well as a small number who didn't want to, because by that point they'd established, they'd met German partners, got married, they'd set up businesses in Germany, and then no longer fell under the purview of the concept of displaced person.
And what were these displaced person camps like? I mean, they just feed them 3 square meals a day and a roof over your head, but what else is there?
they were also very different. So they varied from for example, the Cinecittà film studio outside Rome was used as a DP camp. And so was Landsberg prison, where Hitler was imprisoned and where he wrote Mein Kampf. So some of them were very large. The majority of DPs were in the American zone of occupied Germany, but the single largest DP camp was the one in Belsen, or it was actually in Hohne, just outside Belsen, but the Jews retained the name Belsen because they wanted to use it as a propaganda tool to beat the British and say, look, you're still imprisoning us in Belsen. But for the most part, they were self-governing by the Jews who lived in them. They were kind of extraterritorial spaces where the German authorities, even after the creation of the Federal Republic, didn't really have legal authority. And so they were run by UNRWA, the United Nations Relief and Rehabilitation Administration, which was itself governed by SHAEF, so the supreme headquarters of the Allied Expeditionary Forces. So ultimately they were, in the first years after the war, a military responsibility, although they were run by UNRWA, which was a humanitarian organization. And thereafter, they eventually, those that survived, were run by the Germans, but they were still largely self-governing. And so what you see in them as they develop over time is a return of Jewish politics. You see Jewish religious groups, sporting groups, vocational training, the Jewish press, and of course political organizations. And as all these groups start fighting with each other, so you see a kind of return to normal Jewish life, because everybody's, 3 Jews, 2 opinions, that kind of thing. They're all fighting. So
Yeah.
you see, okay, they're starting to return to a kind of normality, except that they're all waiting to leave. So you see the first kibbutzim and so on set up on German territory.
Oh, right. Yeah. My wife is from Cologne. She's German.
Mm-hmm.
And when we go to Cologne, you can find these little brass plates all over the city drilled into the cobblestone streets. So and so lived here. They were, deported at this date. They were murdered on this date, and here's where they were murdered. Auschwitz, whatever.
Mm-hmm.
But if you were displaced and you went back to your hometown and said, "Well, there's my house. I want my house back," were there instances where there's somebody else living there? Too bad, and they'd lost all their property.
That was very common, particularly in Eastern Europe. So in the Jews, the small number of survivors from France, Belgium, the Netherlands, and so on, largely were able to return home, whatever home meant. They had surviving family. Sometimes they had to deal with. There's still ongoing, of course, restitution cases with respect to property and artworks and so on. But for the Jews of Eastern Europe, this was the real problem, where the surviving Jews of Poland and Hungary in particular, Romania to a greater or lesser extent as well, returned to places where their communities had been completely wiped out, where nobody expected to see them ever again, and where there were people living in their apartments when they hadn't been destroyed. So it's also the case, of course, that there was a huge shortage of accommodation in the post-war period. And one of the things that the new communist regimes in Eastern Europe did, although officially, of course, proclaiming to be atheist and anti-Semitic, was not really to help people, returning Jews, in getting their property back, because it was a way of ingratiating themselves with people who did not necessarily otherwise support the regime. There were certainly trials of perpetrators run by the communist regimes, more so than in the Western countries in the first years after the war. But when it came to restitution, it was much, much harder. And so it's no surprise, actually, that although surviving Jews did return to Poland and Hungary and elsewhere in the region, many left again pretty quickly.
Yeah. Yeah, as you know, in America, there's a big debate about reparations to African Americans and maybe Native Americans. Across multiple generations, or even centuries. That's a harder case to make. It seems much more when you have direct victims who are still alive, they want their stuff back. Or the case of some of these lawsuits over artwork. Where some museum, bought this piece of art from somebody who bought it from somebody who bought it from somebody who was owned by a Jew in 1941. And those are complicated cases. Or Germany paying Israel for the settlement of Jews there and so on. How do you think about reparations in that sense?
It's a small act of repair in a sense, isn't it? I think from the the first act was the Luxembourg Agreement of 1952, when West Germany paid reparations to Israel, and then set up the claims conference. So the conference of material claims against Germany, which it continues to exist to this day, and has substantial amounts of money to assist with still remaining survivors, and also with Holocaust education. They give money to research projects and to Holocaust museums and all sorts of things. Those projects are, I mean, they also have a very interesting history, particularly in the 50s and 60s, when the psychoanalysts I'm talking about now, and other psychologists who were employed by the West German state to adjudicate on some of the cases, used classical Freudian theory to deny people reparations, because they said, oh, if this person is still suffering from trauma, it must be because of something that occurred to them in childhood, not because of what happened to them during the war. And so you then have enormous changes taking place in psychoanalytic theory, and people like Anna Freud and others suddenly think, hang on, our ideas are being used against us. This is outrageous what's happening here. So that's just one kind of small aspect of this history. But again, I think you have to split it up into chronologically and geographically, what applies to certain people. For example, Eastern European Jews were largely excluded from payments because the West Germans wouldn't give money behind the Iron Curtain until the end of the Cold War. And non-Jewish slave laborers from Ukraine and Russia and so on only started to receive reparations payments in the first years of this century, when they were very aged. So it's a long, ongoing process. At Royal Holloway a couple of weeks ago, we had our annual Holocaust lecture, and the woman who gave the talk is a 90-year-old woman who came to Britain on the Kindertransport and became a very successful businesswoman. And she said, it was really moving actually, she said that in the 1950s, when she was offered reparations money by the West Germans, she turned it down, said, this is blood money, I don't want it. And then she said a few years ago, when they said this is our last offer, she said, I took the money and I handed it all over to a charity called Safe Passage, which provides help for refugees. It was really interesting. It was a good take on it, I thought.
Yeah, I like that. Well, Dan, you've been very generous with your time. I love the book. I guess in a way, it's also prescriptive. How can we not do this? Let's not do this again. How do we prevent something like this from happening? What would be your recommendations? Let me put it in context. Last night, just by chance, I'm scanning Netflix to see what I can watch as I fall asleep, and there's Munich, The Edge of War, that drama. I don't know if you've seen this, but
I haven't seen it.
Czechoslovakia. No. It's quite good. I think it's based on a novel, but based on historical facts and so on. We should have stopped Hitler. The West, especially Chamberlain, should not have appeased Hitler and given him the Sudetenland and stopped him there at Munich, not signed the agreement. But of course, that's hindsight. And there's a reason that, the Senate just passed the bill to continue to support Ukraine today, this morning, because we got to stop Putin, because look at what happened at Munich. But again, hindsight, I don't know. How do you think about things we should do as a democracy so this kind of thing doesn't happen again? I know that's kind of a big question.
You want to finish?
No one really knows the answer
to.
Just a small
question. Well, look, I mean, I think there are two things, I suppose. One would be to say, when figures in public life say crazy things, we should not simply dismiss them as buffoons, but maybe take them seriously. Maybe think, hang on, does this person actually mean what they say? And why does this person appeal to a certain constituency? And secondly, I'd say go easy on the austerity politics.
Nice. I like that. Yeah. Very good. Well, hopefully these are lessons we've learned. I mean, if you look at the history of psychology, most of social psychology was done by Jewish intellectuals trying to figure out what happened and why. And particularly in the 50s and 60s, the conformity, obedience to obedience to authority, all that stuff. And, for good reason, let's hope. But I don't, given human nature, as we've been talking about, there are inner demons in there. We have better angels, and we should, tweak the dials to get those to be stronger, or social institutions and norms and laws and so on. But obviously, given the genocides that have happened since then, I was writing about the rape of Nanking, Iris Cheng's famous book. And, there's nothing that the Japanese did to the Chinese in Nanking that would have, not been matched or exceeded what the Nazis did and the SS did. Horrible, just horrible. It's astonishing.
Agreed.
It's in there.
Yeah, exactly.
Yep.
I mean, the problem is the cat's out of the bag, right? And that's it's always it remains something to which people can appeal. It retains a kind of attraction in moments of crisis, I think.
Well, we'll put a link to the book in the show notes for this. I hope everybody reads it. It's, there's massive books on the Holocaust. I have a bunch over there. What I appreciate about yours, it wasn't that long. I could get through the whole thing and still learn a lot of new things. And even if you know nothing about it, it's a nice introduction to the whole thing. So thank you for your work. What's next on your research and writing agenda?
Well, I mentioned the history of psychoanalysis.
The Romania
stuff,
one,
Well, I've just completed a short study on psychoanalysis and Holocaust survival, next I'm going to, which will be out later this year, and I'm going to write a book on the Holocaust in Romania next. I think.
Nice.
I think it needs a deeper treatment.
All right, Dan.
Lovely. Thank you very much for having me.